Welcome to the Psych Central Show, where each episode presents an in-depth look at issues from the field of psychology and mental health, with host Gabe Howard and co-host Vincent M. Wales.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Psych Central Show podcast. My name is Gabe Howard, and with me, as always, is Vincent M. Wales, and we want to remind you that you can get 1 week of free, convenient, affordable, private, online counseling anytime, anywhere by visiting betterhelp.com/psychcentral. We would like to welcome back Dr. John Grohol. Longtime listeners know Dr. Grohol as the editor-in-chief of PsychCentral.com, officially making him our boss, but he's also the podcast's resident researcher of all things psychology and mental health. John, how have you been?
Hey, great to be here, guys. I have been well.
We are glad to have you on. We are going to discuss a really cool topic because you're about to blow our minds, because I think many of us, I'm in my 40s, Vin is also not in his 40s, but we learned about this in high school and college as a legit experiment, and you're about to blow our minds. We're talking about the Stanford Prison Experiment that concluded that if given enough leeway, all people will become evil and awful and fall into their roles, and humanity is doomed.
That might be a little bit of a stretch, but yeah.
But John, what was the Stanford Prison Experiment?
Well, it's a common thing taught across psychology classrooms in college and even in high school. And it's a really fascinating experiment. That's why it's taught so much. It's about an experiment run by a psychologist named Philip Zimbardo back in 1971. And the researchers decided to test what would happen if you put a lot of ordinary people together in a situation that he thought might cause them to sort of act out their very worst behavior. And so he advertised the experiment and received 24 mostly white male college students to come and get paid $15 a day to participate in the experiment. And he assigned the subjects into two groups randomly. One group was going to pretend that they were the prisoners, and the other group was going to pretend that they were the guards. So 12 prisoners, 12 guards. The actual experiment had 9 and 9, and then they actually had 3 alternatives in case one of the people got sick or whatnot. And then they put them in a made-up prison in the basement of one of the Stanford University's academic buildings. And they thought they would let the experiment go for 2 weeks and just kind of see what would happen as it went along.
So what were the rules of the experiment as Dr. Zimbardo published? What did he say the rules the participants were supposed to follow were?
Well, he suggested that there really weren't a lot of rules, that the guards were to act as guards, and that they didn't really have a set of rules or behaviors that they were expected to do. He basically suggested that they were just told to be authoritarian and, that they had control of the prison and the prisoners, and that they couldn't physically harm the prisoners or withhold food or drink. But the description of the experiment such was that he basically suggested that he wasn't really giving them a way to act or a way to behave towards the prisoners.
So he left them to their own devices.
That was the belief up until a few years ago, yes.
But it didn't quite go like that. And the thing didn't last the whole 2 weeks either, did it?
Nope. After just 5 days, the experiment was called off after the guards started behaving very cruelly towards the prisoners. The prisoners also, in turn, many of them had become depressed and submissive. And so the researchers decided to call off the experiment early for the sake of all of the prisoners and guards' health and mental health.
And all the way back in 1971, when this experiment was conducted, Dr. Zimbardo said that people were allowed to quit if they so choose. Is that correct?
That is what he told us for many, many years. What we're finding out now is that it's not at all clear whether people had as much freedom to leave the experiment as he suggested they did.
Before we discuss the controversy, the first thing that I want to ask is, did anybody try to duplicate his results? Because in the scientific method, being able to duplicate results is very important.
So this experiment is problematic to duplicate because it actually raised a lot of ethical questions about the treatment of subjects and a subject's rights in research. And after this experiment was run, and due to this experiment and other scientific experiments conducted in the 1960s and 70s, subjects' research rights were actually strengthened and greatly improved. And the review board that has to review every scientific study before it's allowed to go forward at a university has a lot more leeway in ensuring that subjects can't sort of be abused in any way. And so what happened is there were a couple of attempts at replication of this experiment. One of them was in 1979, which, according to Zimbardo, I haven't actually read this particular study, that he says that they kind of found pretty much what he found. A more famous replication attempt was done in in 2001, and it was done as a part also of a television show in the UK. And that experiment, that show, which wasn't quite a mirror duplication, couldn't reproduce the effects of the original experiment.
What were the results of that in a nutshell?
That show, and I'm not sure I would call it an experiment any more than I would call the Stanford Prison Experiment an experiment, because these are things that really don't follow the scientific process in any way, shape, manner, or form. It did not find that people just fell into a situational role that they couldn't get out of. They did not find that guards starting to act in very authoritative and abusive ways. Instead, they actually found that guards were very empathetic towards the prisoners, and when a prisoner complained about being unwell, the guards were actually trying to help the prisoner.
One of the things that I have seen in not only in some of the recent things that have come out, but things that just stood out to me even when I first heard about this experiment, were that it just seemed flawed from the very get-go, because he got these students, if I'm not mistaken, by placing an ad, and the ad itself specified that it was a prison type experiment, right?
Yes.
So that would mean that the people who are signing up for this were inclined to be interested in doing a prison type thing, and therefore could have been, a little Machiavellian to start with.
Yeah, I think the crux of the argument is whether there's some other alternative explanation that could also account for the findings of Zimbardo's experiment. And I think we actually have quite a few possible confounds or problems with the experiment that really draw into question its conclusions and its results. One of them, of course, is the fact that, as it turns out, it looks like the guards are probably not just given a general list of guidelines on how to act, but they were actually encouraged and told to act in very aggressive way. That this was not a part of any of the written scientific part of the study that was recorded for the journal publishing later on. But in later interviews, we're finding out that the guards were actually instructed to be a lot more aggressive and hostile towards the prisoners by the supervisor, if not by Zimbardo himself.
And that just ruins it right there.
Right.
So they were told to be aggressive, therefore they were aggressive. So to draw the conclusion that it was their own free will where they chose to be aggressive is sort of out the window. This is really just proof that they can follow instructions from the authority figure who pays them.
Yeah, I mean, and the great thing about this experiment is that Zimbardo has put all of the video and documentation and photographs and transcripts on a website. So people can, really delve into it. And unfortunately, that has not been to his benefit, because this is where people have found out that he published and said one thing, and apparently did something else in the actual experiment. So he actually told the guards ahead of time, you're going to create a sense of powerlessness in the prisoners, and you will have all the power and they'll have none. I mean, he's creating the expected role that he wants the guards and the prisoners to act in. So it's not just that there's a drama or a play being played out here. It's that he is actually, as the playwright, scripting a lot of what the expected plot is going to be.
So he was not an objective observer in this experiment at all.
Not from what I can tell, and from what other researchers and analysts who have looked at the data and who have looked at the transcripts have discovered.
We know that this was a very popular experiment because most of us have heard of it. Forget the controversy. Most of us have been taught this in school. It's taught in colleges. You can Google it and read all about it. Other websites that have nothing to do with psychology or mental health have written about the Stanford Prison Experiment. So this really got him a lot of cachet in the community. He was kind of a rock star, for lack of a better word. So why has it taken so long for anybody? Because, 1971 to 2018, didn't they realize that something was amiss in 1975?
Well, that is one of the challenges that psychology as a profession and some other professions actually are also facing in terms of the science and the expected science and where we are with it. That a lot of things aren't being tried to be replicated. And when they are tried to be replicated by other researchers who have nothing to do with the original experiment or study, we're finding that replication is difficult and doesn't always happen in the way that the original experiment suggested the data should play out. So I think that we're finding that this kind of problem is not unique to Zimbardo nor the Stanford Prison Experiment, but an experiment, even a famous one like this, can go for years, or in this case, a very long time before people start really questioning some of the basic foundation and the premises that the experiment was based on.
How did Zimbardo react? What's his take on the criticism?
So after the controversy kind of took a new life once again on June 7th, when Ben Bloom published a very lengthy article over at medium.com describing some of the major issues and problems with the experiment as he saw them. And in reaction to that article and the media coverage that was given to that article, Dr. Zimbardo decided that it needed a very thorough rebuttal, and he published a very lengthy rebuttal on the Stanford Prison Experiment website that dealt with all of the criticisms. Now, I have to say some of the responses definitely deserve a second look in terms of what Bloom was alleging. But some of them are, he kind of glossed over the kinds of things that he didn't really want to address. And that's commonplace when a researcher wants to focus on, the things that he can kind of prove to not be true. And he doesn't really have an answer to some of the other criticisms that Bloom made.
This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp.com. Secure, convenient, and affordable online counseling. All counselors are licensed, accredited professionals. Anything you share is confidential. Schedule secure video or phone sessions, plus chat and text with your therapist whenever you feel it's needed. A month of online therapy often costs less than a single traditional face-to-face session. Go to BetterHelp.com/Psych Central and experience 7 days of free therapy to see if online counseling is right for you. BetterHelp.com/Psych Central.
So it seems like we can't really say that this experiment, quote, experiment, accomplished what he had intended. But is there anything that we can really take away from it that is plausible?
So it's really hard to say. At the end of the day, when you look at something like this, it's an interesting anecdote devised by a researcher uh, in a kind of artificial situation. And I think I would argue that he stacked the deck from the onset in the so-called experiment to really kind of get the findings that maybe he was hoping to get. And I hate to say that this is commonplace in psychology or research in general, but researchers are well aware of how to design an experiment to ensure that the data that they're looking for will have a greater likelihood of showing up, basically. And so I think it's hard to say that this study told us anything about human behavior in the way that Zimbardo believes it does. I think instead what it actually has taught us are what happens when researchers who don't have the same kinds of ethical guidelines that we do today are sort of given control to do, whatever it is that they want to study or research. And it's taught us a lot about how to ensure that we keep research subjects safe in the future. The good stuff that came out of this was stronger protection for research subjects in all scientific research, not just in psychology.
There's lots of studies that are conducted, day in and day out and have been for decades. This one is famous because it piqued the public interest, and it's continued to pique the public interest. And when the findings were revealed, people believed it. They accepted it. They're just like, that makes sense. Why is the public so quick to believe that these findings are true?
I think people in general look for easy, simple explanations for human behavior. And people want an explanation for why something is happening, whether it's good, whether it's bad. But especially when bad things happen, people want a reason and an understanding of why that bad thing has happened, even when all of the data and all of the research that we have can't really give us that explanation. And that's really frustrating to human beings to have a question unanswered when it helps us make sense of a tragedy, or if it helps us make sense of irrational behavior. I think this study was an attempt to make sense of irrational behavior. Shortly after it was published, there were some pretty significant prison riots, and people turned to this study to help understand the context of those prison riots. Unfortunately, this study can't really tell us anything about real life prisons or prison riots because it was a completely artificial laboratory study done with 24 white young college males, none of which who had any type of criminal record or any kind of criminal behavior on in their past. And I'm not sure how you're expected to generalize a laboratory experiment of that type to the very diverse demographics of your typical prison in the 1970s or today.
Well, that's the part that I want to touch on real quick. What you said is that the participants were young white males in college with no criminal records, and this study proved that they were bad. So the public didn't just accept that bad things happen in society, they accepted that otherwise good people would be bad if you allowed them to be. I mean, isn't that really the crux of the study? It really has nothing to do with prison at all. It's basically saying that if you give people enough rope, they will become evil.
Yeah, I believe the study's conclusion would be the argument that if put into a situation, you will start playing a role within that situation that the situation defines for you. So if you find yourself swept up in a riot in the middle of downtown, New York City tomorrow, according to the findings of this experiment, you will be a happy participant in that riot, and you will start breaking windows and stealing stuff.
Mob mentality, right?
Mob mentality, absolutely. But as we've, found out in the intervening 30, 40 years since this experiment was originally conducted, human behavior and even social group behavior is far more complex than a simple explanation such as situational role playing can provide an answer to it. Obviously you don't throw out your morals and you don't throw out everything that makes Gabe or Vincent, just because you're in a certain situation where the roles are strongly defined. That doesn't mean that your personality just completely goes away and doesn't have anything to say about your behavior moving forward. And I think that's the important takeaway, is that human behavior is complex. Human behavior in groups is even more complex. And simplistic answers such as the Stanford Prison Experiment attempted to provide us really do a disservice to having that, deeper understanding of our behavior and other people's behavior.
Do you think that people in the general public, due to their belief in this experiment, have concluded that prison guards are just evil people?
I think the takeaway for most people is that that if you were put into a role or a situation, if you were given a badge and a gun, you would be expected to act a certain way, and that the badge and the gun would kind of take over your personality, and that that explains why prisons are so bad. That the guards act like guards because they're given authority over people who have no power, and the prisoners act like prisoners because that's their role. They're locked in a cell most of the day. They don't have a voluntary freedom. I just think it's a little bit more complicated than that. I don't think that I think a prison is a very unique kind of setting, and it definitely has its own psychology and dynamics. But to study a prison setting, you have to go into an actual prison. You cannot create a fake prison in your psychology building basement and then expect to learn anything of value in that kind of experiment.
Getting back to what you just said about, give them a gun and a badge and power, and things go awry, that's generally a very common attitude today towards police officers, law enforcement in general. And it's kind of sad that we've dehumanized the individual officers and are looking at them as a large group of powerful people who just want to lord that power over everybody else.
Absolutely. This is a reminder that being in a uniform, whether you're a police officer or a judge or a janitor, it doesn't make you that career. You as a person are still there. And I know police officers, and I know how traumatic it is to ever have to fire their gun, ever, even if you aren't shooting at someone. It's a big deal when a police officer fires their gun, and it's not something that most of them do without a lot of forethought in terms of deciding that they're in a dangerous situation and they feel like they need to pull the trigger. It's never so simple as saying, oh, well, they were scared and they fired their gun. Sure, that might have been a part of it, but that's not the whole picture. And we do a disservice to the complexity of the human spirit, the human mind, to suggest that it's just an instinctual reaction because they're wearing a badge and they have a gun.
So how does the psychology community feel about this experiment now? What is the general consensus of Dr. Zimbardo's work?
So it's really hard to understand what the consensus of a given profession is towards a specific individual. Dr. Zimbardo was elected the president of the American Psychological Association. And so obviously, I think his fellow psychologists back at that time that he was elected thought very highly of him. It would be hard to say, whether that's changing and whether psychology professors will actually take some of this criticism to heart and use this as a teaching moment to explain not talk about the experiment so much, but talk about the methodology used for the experiment and how the results were published and disseminated, because most people found out and learned about the experiment not through any kind of scientific research journal, but through an article that he wrote for the New York Times Magazine. So certainly that is an interesting, footnote to this experiment.
So do you think that this experiment should still be taught in schools, and if so, how?
Yeah, absolutely. It should be taught, but not in the sense of a scientific study. It's not a scientific study. It's a very strange anecdotal psychodrama played out by that was designed by Dr. Zimbardo and the other people who worked on the experiment. And the results are not nearly as interesting as talking about what the researchers did, how they did it, how they set up their methodology to unfortunately introduce bias that they didn't seem to recognize at the time, and how it led to greater protection for research subjects in the future.
Really appreciate that. Dr. Grohol, it's always great to have you on here, and not just because you own the place. What parting words do you have for the audience? Because many people who listen, we're not professionals. We're trying to find information on the internet to make our lives better. And as this is illustrated, it's sort of a buyer beware. How should we know what we can accept and what we can't accept? What are some maybe quick hints and tips to, not be duped?
So it's really challenging as a reader of the latest, health study that came out, and you learn about it on WebMD or some other news website that you read, because you can't really tell from the article about the study as to whether this study was robustly done, whether it was a good scientific study, whether it was generalizable because it used a very large sample size or a very diverse and demographically appropriate sample size. These are really interesting questions and often are not answered in consumer news articles about research. And I would just say, keep a skeptical eye on any research that you read online. I usually read the news story about the study, and if I find that it's really interesting finding and something that kind of sticks with me, I'll probably file it away for future reference. And what I'm looking for in the future is I want to hear about the second study done that confirms the results of that first study. And that's when you start knowing that something it seems to really have some legs to it in terms of research. For instance, there's 100 studies about things that are good for your health and bad for your health in terms of coffee or wine or this or that or the other thing. But we're starting to have a consensus with some of those beverages. And for instance, it really looks like having a few cups of coffee every day is beneficial to your health. Having too much coffee is bad. So 6 to 8 cups, probably too much. But 2 to 4 cups, that seems to be the sweet spot right now. And there's multiple studies that show health benefits for this. So if it's something else, if it's not coffee, but it just happens to be a associated healthy behavior that coffee drinkers do that non-coffee drinkers don't do, that does not seem to be a part of, the answer to, whether coffee is beneficial or not. So I look for multiple studies on the same topic that are sort of having the same finding or a similar finding before I start taking it to heart.
If there's one thing that I could just force everybody out there in internet land to get through their heads, is that old expression, correlation does not imply causation. I cannot tell you how many times I have to point that out to coworkers who point to these news articles on some study or another, and just point out to them, it's like, okay, so there's a connection, so the hell what? It doesn't prove that it caused this issue.
Absolutely, and you've touched upon a topic for a whole nother show.
Oh yeah,
which is
yeah,
that researchers themselves are guilty of overstating their results and often confusing the question of correlation and causation in their actual study that gets through peer review and gets published in prestigious journals. So the problem starts right there, and then it's amplified by press offices of universities who take that, minor, maybe moderate statement about causation and turn it into a definite, this definitely causes that, so.
Yeah.
Yes. Oxygen causes death. 100% of people who breathe die. Yeah. John, thank you so much for being on the show. We always appreciate it. And of course, you are welcome back anytime. And everybody out in podcasting land, please like and share us so that we can grow and become famous. We will see everybody next week.
Thank you for listening to the Psych Central Show. Please rate, review, and subscribe on iTunes or wherever you found this podcast. We encourage you to share our show on social media and with friends and family. Previous episodes can be found at psychcentral.com/show. Psychcentral.com is the internet's oldest and largest independent mental health website. Psych Central is overseen by Dr. John Grohol, a mental health expert and one of the pioneering leaders in online mental health. Our host, Gabe Howard, is an award-winning writer and speaker who travels nationally. You can find more information on Gabe at gabehoward.com. Our co-host, Vincent M. Wales, is a trained suicide prevention crisis counselor and author of several award-winning speculative fiction novels. You can learn more about Vincent at vincentmwales.com. If you have feedback about the show, please email talkback@psychcentral.com.